So look, a long time ago, during the early days of video gaming, this game came out called Cyberpunk 2077. And while it was a buggy mess that had plenty of problems with the mechanics of it, the quality of the AI, the glitchy mess that was your character, and the frankly never-ending issue of being aesthetically based on cyberpunk, but only really following through on the cyber part of that statement and sort of missing the whole punk aspect of being anti the dystopian corporations that showed up. But this game captured the attentions of many, including myself, and is a favourite game for a lot of people that we go back to often, in spite of all its flaws. And because of that, I made a video a while back talking about the trans representation within Cyberpunk 2077. A video that was far from my best and quite incomplete, so I deleted it, and now nobody will ever see it ever again. Hopefully. Now though, with more experience under my belt, I want to take another crack at really trying to figure out where exactly does Cyberpunk 2077 stand as a model for the inclusion of transgender people within a fundamental form of media for many people to engage with and interact with us, the marketplace of the gaming and gamers. So let's jump in and talk about just that. No more need to waffle our way through an introduction. You get it by now what we're doing here. You probably honestly got it at the title. It's a video about Cyberpunk 2077 and the trans stuff in it. Easy. So let's start with the first place that many people are going to see any kind of transness or gender non-conforming identity within the game. And that is with your own customizable character, whose identity you will be embodying for the next many hours that you might put into this game. Now, customizable characters have been hyped quite a bit when it comes to open world RPGs, especially by gaming magazines who like to discuss the way in which transgender options are now available, like in regards to, Cyberpunk 2077 or Hogwarts Legacy, where they basically mean the body configuration that you pick is not necessarily associated with a specific gender identity. The problem with all this hyping from these magazines is that, firstly, it's not exactly a perfect system, such as in Cyberpunk 2077, where the defining element for what gender you are referred to as in the game, i.e. the pronouns that are used for you, is not essentially your body type or your genitalia, but is instead the voice that you choose. If you have the feminine voice, people will use she/her pronouns, and vice versa for the masculine voice. And at the same time, there are only two body types in the game anyway, a masculine or feminine body, that then have their own restrictions on customization that go along with that. It's a bit of a mess, defined by presumably restrictive limitations in regard to time or in regards to perception that they had of the character of V that they wanted to be true regardless of what the player wished to play with the character for. Something that actually plays into the more major issue that one can take with the idea that Cyberpunk 2077 offers trans character creation options, and does kind of play into the idea that any character customizer can offer trans options. Because at most, what you can make is a V who aesthetically matches your body type as a trans person, who visually conforms to a transgender identity or intersex identity as one might think of it, because this could be either one of those, and oftentimes intersex people are overlooked in this conversation about inclusion in video game options. But the visual side of things is not the entirety of a transgender person or their identity. I know, this is a pretty wild thing for me to say here, but there is an actual person involved in that whole thing whose connection to their transgenderness is not linked entirely to how they dress or what their body looks like. And Cyberpunk 2077 fails to really encompass that for your character that you create. You have no chances, as the controller of V, to have them interact with anything in the world, or anybody, in a way that confirms or aligns with this transgender identity that you wanted V to have when you created them in the first place. the identity that you have chosen in the character creator to emulate, an identity that might in fact be your own in real life, and that you wanted to see represented in who you get to play in a game, is never canonically confirmed or given a chance to be roleplayed into in anything more than just the aesthetics that you are granted some control over at the start. All the identities that might go along with those body options are effectively negated by that designer intention, by their personal intention of what character they want you to be playing, the mindset and perspective that they have written V to be already, and that ignores whatever choices you might have made or want them to be in your own outside of the game audience sense. Predominantly, what it comes across as is a white cisgender V, especially when you move out of the initial 10 minutes of backstory that you do kind of get to choose.
Well, who do we have here? My childhood? Let's see. Racing my bobber for the first time through the hills?
I have those reports you asked for.
They were supposed to be ready yesterday.
The Nomad, Street Kid or Corpo backstory, and those are effectively relegated to single lines or random inserted comments and a single quest down the road as a reference to those parts of V's identity after that first 10 minutes, so they might as well not exist either. There is a homogenization, effectively, of the character that you are playing, no matter what input you initially put in, that pushes them all to be kind of the same V. For an example of this from a different standpoint than the transgender or gender identity one, and also, can we talk about how easy it would have been to just give you a pronoun option at some point? And then just have people use she, he, they, depending on your choice there, rather than have it be based on your voice? Wouldn't that be the most simple of all options, and it would give you at least a little bit more control over that? I mean, come on, this is 2077. Surely gender politics and sexual dynamics have advanced to a degree that in a world where people are able to effectively modify their bodies with technology to slow time or jump high buildings or have fucking arm blades, pronouns would be a thing that comes up when you scan people and it just gives you that information on them and you can just do the same in return? Regardless, I wanted to talk about the other identities that example what I'm talking about here. And let's say that you wanted to play a Japanese character, as a Japanese person, because it's quite rare to find Western protagonists that let you do that. Well, you can make the character look like you for sure, in the character creator, but when they get out into the world of Night City, a city that is literally an amalgamation of Japanese and American cultures in this kind of strange hybridization, and let's be real here, this is not the video for a discussion around the exploitation and exoticization or eroticization of Japanese cultural identity, though that is something that you should want to find out more about and how it relates to the entire genre of cyberpunk, and you should probably go and do that research on your own, there's a lot to dig through there. Well, when you go out into this world full of Japanese cultural affects and Japanese people, you get no interactions at all that relate to that. You don't get to connect with the world that has been created in a way that would affirm the Japanese identity or Japanese heritage or Japanese cultural identity that you might be currently thinking of your character as. What about if you wanted to make a Haitian Creole person? Because you basically never get to see that identity of yourself reflected in the games that you play. Well, a pretty big moment in the game is when you go down to Pacifica and meet the Voodoo Boys, a gang of Haitian Creole people who live outside of the jurisdiction of Night City and whose culture is heavily seeped into the neighbourhood they live in. Well, much like with everything we've discussed so far, you don't get an opportunity to engage with that, to showcase a single moment where you acknowledge or reflect the cultural identity that you, the player, wanted the character to have when you initially created them. In fact, the actions or attitude of V in that moment do really work into that homogenized white identity that we mentioned earlier. An identity that just reflects an all-encompassing character that many companies end up writing their customizable characters to be. What it reveals in these moments to you, the player, is a fact that until those points you might have been able to ignore. Which is that ultimately, what you are doing with your character, what you are thinking or feeling that V should be based on, everything you are being told that lets you know you have some modicum of control here, is a lie, and that you don't. And the identity you made with your V is a headcanon. It only exists within your own mind, and you need to keep finding ways to justify it as the story continues to ignore whatever you might want V to be. Headcanons are a thing that I've always argued to be valid or fine to run with, but it is difficult to do that in a game because it can be immersion breaking when you keep struggling to find links that connect your character to what your headcanon of who you are playing is. And all of this isn't necessarily the fault of CD Projekt Red. Every game with a customizable character ends up either homogenizing them into the actual character they intended it to be, or has them be such a non-identity in the story that it doesn't really matter what you play, a la Skyrim.
Your kind always seems to find trouble. Captain, what should we do? He's not on the list.
Forget the list. He goes to the block.
It's not really the developer's fault. It's the fault of the medium in which they're developing in, which doesn't afford them the time to be able to create a game which would encompass all identities that somebody might want to play with when they customize their character. It would be unreasonable to expect CD Projekt Red to have backstories that allow your V to reflect the myriad of identities that any player want it to have, because to do so with the current system of video game creation would take fucking forever. It's why RPG games like D&D are superior in this regards. Video games can very easily tell one character's story, and can possibly tell 5 or 10 stories in a single game. But if you want to be able to really access the whole gamut of reflections of who you might be, the ideal way is tabletops that give you complete control over not just the creation of a character, but their actions, their statements, their perspective on the world, and their choice to incorporate their history that you want them to have into relations with others. Cyberpunk 2077 can't let your headcanon version of V become canon, and that was never going to be a possibility. You were never going to be able to play a Japanese person, or a Haitian Creole person, or a transgender person. And like I said, I don't think that's essentially on the company because they didn't really hype it as anything more than just body options and some character aesthetic customization options. All of this is really on the gaming magazines who want to get clicks, and so call it transgender options in a new game, when that does not reflect the truth at all. We're not getting to play a transgender person, we're getting to perhaps visually match an identity that we hold, without it being any deeper than that. When a game comes in with an actual trans protagonist, then you can start using transgender character as the term for it. Because until then, it's just a meaningless term that does not reflect the reality of the situation. And while it's not CD Projekt Red that this was hyped like this, a problem kind of on every developer is that homogenization into a single perspective that does occur, and that most developers end up turning into the majority homogenization, a straight, cis, white person's perspective. That could probably change. Now we move from the realm of things that are not necessarily CD Projekt Red's responsibility, the notion of character customization and its role in selling identities that it cannot actually match within the game, and into stuff that they do have control over. The characters and visual representation of identities that are transgender or trans-adjacent. To save the best for last, we're going to start with that trans-adjacent thing first, and discuss the model used in the mix-it-up ad campaign seen throughout the game on billboards and TV screens and honestly just kind of all over the place. Now, this was a pretty big part of my initial video that I made on Cyberpunk 2077, and was something that I took a lot of grievances with to build my case for why CD Projekt Red was being transphobic in the game. And I do think in reflection, that was a flawed argument. I bring that up because I want to emphasize that notion that I am not perfect, and I will never pretend that any of my video essays are the definitive or correct word on the subject. I can, and have been, very fucking wrong, and will probably continue to be until the day I die. But anyways, the mix-it-up ad all centers around this image here, and the character presented within. Now, I argued that this reflected an eroticization of transgender bodies, and the differences that we represent from the majority perspective on a body, with the bulging and present penis on a feminine body being the main eye-catching element. And yes, before we get into it, this could be an intersex person, or intersex adjacent as well. I, yet again, really don't want to pretend that intersex people don't exist in these conversations, or have a part in it, because plenty of other people are going to have already done that. A lot of comments on the original video said something that I think is actually quite accurate, which is that yes, this is eroticization by the corporations of this aesthetic identity to sell a brand, but a lot of people get eroticized in the same way, regardless of their status as transgender or not in the world of Cyberpunk 2077. And that is true. Sex in advertising is a big thing that you consistently see over and over again. The Sasha Devon experience, Wet Dream, Midnight Lady, Mr. Stud, Watson Whore, Avant, Khalil Rousseau, Abydos, more technologies. We see across an array of body types and sexual identities that they are all being used to sell products. So why would a gender non-conforming body be any different? And you know what? That's kind of a fair point. The Mix-It-Up ad doesn't really stand out as anything majorly different to what others are also experiencing. And my discomfort with seeing it, with seeing someone who is within my community or community adjacent being displayed like that, is a discomfort that is part of the message of the world, that is part of that theme of corporate exploitation of bodies and identities because they want to and can, with no regard for the actual people behind that aesthetic they're using. I, and we, are meant to feel uncomfortable, and so there is not much more to say here, especially because they're not a character we ever meet or get to engage with in any way that lets us start to see them as representation of some kind. But before I move on to our final major discussion point about transgender stuff in Cyberpunk 2077, I want to briefly make a stop on this flight at the station of the real world, because there is a real world thing that happened from this Mix-It-Up ad that definitely does raise a few questions. And that was the cosplaying of cisgender people as this model. A cosplaying that was a finalist at the Cyberpunk Cosplay contest in 2019 that was hosted, endorsed and pushed by CD Projekt Red on all their socials. Now, like I said, the arguments about the way that the world is created and crafted, the exploitation and yada yada yada, whatever, do not apply here. Because this is about the real world. Our world, where, real people live in. And it's not about reflecting themes or embodying messages around dystopian settings, though all of that might definitely be true for the real world too. What we're talking about here is the uncomfortable nature of having a transgender body and identity used as something to adopt by a cisgender person, the idea of our bodies being a plaything almost, or a show or a dress that they put on to have fun with, or to mess around with. Now, I'm not trying to cancel anybody here, which is why I'm not saying the model's name or anything. I don't think you should go and harass them, because why the fuck would you do that? Who's that helping? Is it making you feel better? Because if it is, talk to a therapist. Get help. I'm merely pointing out how this is something that cis people consistently seem to be okay with, at the ignorance of the trans people who find others playing the role of them in an erotic manner to be an unsettling form of expropriation. I don't think any minority likes to see their identities become costumes, and I'm yet again not wanting to use this as a way of condemning somebody. I wouldn't hold this up as an example of why CD Projekt Red failed, or that this is a case of them being totally transphobic. I'm merely saying that if you're in the camp that sees this as nothing wrong at all, maybe try and consider it from the perspective of the trans people who do find it uncomfortable, and wonder if you would be so okay with it then. I don't want to harp on this, because there isn't really much more to say here. And honestly, we really do need to move on to our next major discussion element of this video essay, which you might have noticed I left till last because I wanted you to stick around. Saving the best till last, pretty conniving stuff, huh? Dragging you all the way through this crap to get to the actual meat of the video. If only I started putting my face on the videos pulling a shocked expression with big red arrows, I could actually make it big on YouTube. But I don't like my face being on thumbnails. I think it looks really ugly. Could you imagine seeing just like... Or... Is that what you want? Is that what you want on a thumbnail? It looks horrible. So Claire Russell is our big sticking point for this entire video. The linchpin upon which the whole discussion is basically reliant upon. A character who appears super early in the game when you first go into the hardcore mercenary bar Afterlife to begin the big mission of Act 1. She is the bartender for the club, and she interacts with you and your good friend Jackie Wells, who absolutely nothing bad happens to whatsoever.
Death is nothing but the final flourish. Oh, and by the way, name's Jackie Wells. You want to write down my recipe?
Sure.
And that's all you get from her for a while, until she calls you further down the line to come and help her with what is her major outside of work hobby: violent street racing on the streets of Night City. See, the thing about street fights though, the streets always win. And by that, what I mean is that as you do her racing questline, you discover that her main motivation for racing at this moment is getting close to this guy who was responsible for killing her husband. And ultimately you end up making the choice of either helping her to get her revenge by ramming the douchebag off the road, and then she puts a cap in his ass.
Fuck!
Catch up to him, quick!
Your leisurely stroll now is just a bad case of wet socks.
How's life, Samson?
Or, I don't know, just like quitting the game. I'm sorry, but is anybody out here actually trying to finish the final race? Like, all you get is a measly $2,000 and 200 experience in return for making Claire hate you. It's like the worst trade in the world. And yes, as we are about to get into it, doing so does in fact probably make you transphobic, because Claire is trans. Now, this isn't something that you will find out just from meeting her a few times or from seeing her in the afterlife. Well, unless you are some kind of trans hyperstan and recognise that her voice actor is none other than the moderately famous trans voice actor Maddie Taylor, who we previously mentioned in the Fairly Odd Parents video. Yeah, anyone who clicks that voice might have been clued in a whole bunch earlier to the situation with this character, but for everybody else, the clues sort of build up as you see her truck, the Beast, which has a trans flag on the dashboard and a trans flag on the back bumper. Now, sure, maybe she just has a trans flag to show her support for trans people, even though this is the only fucking place the flag appears in the entire game, and if that's the desperate statement that you need to cling to in your attempt to convince yourself that minorities don't exist in your video games, well, then the conversations with Claire must have been a fucking nightmare. Because when you gain her trust by helping her out, she talks to you about how her husband was one of the few people who stuck around with her through her transition and helped her out when she came out from the surgeries, which then ultimately culminated in them getting together.
I mentioned Dean before. My husband, yeah?
Wheel to your heat, right?
Sweetest man I ever knew. We were friends before my gender transition. Brought daffodils to the hospital. To new beginnings, he said.
Were you married long?
12 years.
Yeah, the transness thing just kinda hits you in the face at this point. Almost like you walked into... Shit. I really thought I had a funny bit here about, like, a place that's really transgender, and if you, like, walk into it, like, oh god, wow, this is so trans. But I'm struggling to think of one that, like, screams transgender people. Insert your own joke. I can't do all the work in this video essay. And that's basically all there is for Claire. She just gets that side quest line, and that's kinda it. But I mean, it is quite a lot. And she is a really cool character whose transness is part of who she is, but doesn't define her. She has interests and hobbies, and a life that exists separate from her trans identity, but when it becomes relevant to a conversation, she doesn't shy away from bringing it up to people that she feels comfortable around, if your V has become that kind of friend for her. And that's good, because sometimes a trans character kinda info-dumps their entire private and personal life on the protagonist with basically no connection or relationship. Like the developers are desperately trying to show that they're totally cool and not bigoted and put in a transgender, okay? So just, give them the thumbs up. But Claire clearly showcases an attempt to make her a character first and foremost, whose personality is believable, and whose choice to share is not forced or awkwardly placed. The trans flags are a fantastic touch that she would have those symbols connected to her identity on the big part of her life, her truck. And having a trans voice actor involved in the process is both A, probably a reason behind why this was so well written, and B, allows them to avoid that painful situation where a role that should be an easy cinch for trans people in an industry that is quite difficult for them to break into is given to a cis person instead. I mean, every single complaint that I have had about trans video game characters, and that I will continue to have, is basically non-existent here. CD Projekt Red kinda hit a home run with Claire Russell, and I would use this as a great blueprint for any developer who is looking at making one of their side characters a trans person. Honestly, I would merely suggest that the only criticism is maybe they need to make more trans people, and also presenting a more diverse range of trans identity would be a great step beyond this, because of course there's always room for improvement. But don't let that criticism take away from the success in Cyberpunk 2077. This is a great piece of trans representation, and should be acknowledged as such. And with that glowing review and recommendation, I want to address my final reference back to the deleted video, because Claire Russell didn't make an appearance in it at all. I know, I made a video about trans rep in Cyberpunk 2077 and didn't include the trans character, and that's because I was a really shit video essay YouTuber. Like, you might think things are bad right now, but trust me, they were a whole lot worse back then. And I guess take this as a sign of how much I've improved. And to all the fans who originally got mad about that video that I dogged on Cyberpunk 2077's trans representation, this video here can be considered as sort of my apology for honestly whiffing my analysis that badly. I make mistakes, pretty serious ones, and all I can hope is to try and improve upon them and get better down the line. So that's the Cyberpunk 2077 trans video. An array of discussions to be had that really do cover a lot of bases worth mentioning about trans identity in video game spaces. And I think an overall pretty positive experience, and as close to amazing as I've seen in a while. At least since, Dragon Age. If you liked what you saw here, and want to see me do more, especially more video game stuff, then the best way to encourage that is by liking, sharing, subscribing and commenting, because otherwise I'm just gonna get scared right back to doing reviews of TV show episodes, because that's what seems to do well, and YouTube is an anxious place for any sort of change. If you really, really like what I do, then going to my Patreon and subscribing to that Patreon is a fantastic way of ensuring that I have access to the various things like food, electricity and internet that allow me to live in this crazy world where those things are not guaranteed for us, even though they are basic human necessities. Pretty dystopic stuff if you ask me. It's almost like we're living in cyberpunk right now. The names of all those in the $5 and up category should be scrolling past the screen right now, and I really do appreciate them and everybody else on the page for allowing me to be more comfortable working on YouTube videos without worrying about the frankly unreliable income source that it represents. It also allows me to overcome some of that anxiety that stops me from trying new things in my videos, and that means a lot. Other than all of that, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day.